All right, good day, everybody. My name's John Kueven. I'm going to be going through the business section for the ACHE Board of Governors exam tutorial. I want to thank you for being part of the program with the Georgia Association of Healthcare Executives. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is John Kueven. I'm a member of GAHI. I currently serve as Senior Vice President and President of Wellstar Cobb Hospital. I have been in healthcare for going on 15 years and worked in various roles out of grad school at UAB. I worked at North Mississippi Medical Center. I've worked at Boston Children's Hospital over their transplant program and international office, chief operating officer out of Memorial Hermann system in Texas for about 5.5 years out in Houston. And now I've been with Wellstar going on over 3 years. I've spent the first part of my time with Wellstar as president at Paulding Hospital and now as president at Cobb Hospital. And I'm excited to present today some of the business aspects of the Board of Governors exam. So we're going to dive right in. And a lot of what you'll hear today is a little bit of that MBA 101 and a review of terms. But important to know, because you may get some direct questions around terminology, and this is how we generally see it phrased or referenced within the Board of Governors exam. We're going to start by talking about what we will cover today. The business questions are about 9% of the total questions. So around 18 of the questions on the Board of Governors exam is around these general business terms, and they focus on what you see below. So we're going to talk about strategic planning principles, marketing principles and tools, some techniques for business plan development, implementation, assessment, principles of some public affairs and community relations, functions of organizational policy and procedure, some socioeconomic environment, and basic business contracts. Not intended to be a full legal review, but some overview that are need to know around business contracts. So let's jump right into our strategic planning. And one thing that we need to make sure we keep in mind is that strategic planning, it's all related, right? Strategic planning, marketing, business plan development, all of these should be interrelated with your strategic management of the organization. Our strategic goals should be cascaded down into marketing efforts and business plans, and it should really drive what we do for an organization. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do strategic planning. I'm going to focus today on some key terms that are part of the overall strategic planning process for most organizations. The first to note is the purpose of it. Why do we do strategic planning? It's to optimize our organization's future exchange relationships. Kind of a fancy way of saying we are organizing in how we're going to continue to do business into the future. What relationships do we need to establish? How are we going to exchange goods and services with the people that we serve? The strategic planning process should always be market-oriented or community-oriented, right? We want to make sure we're focused on those that we serve, and it should be proactive. We don't want to be reactive in strategic planning. This is where we think about where we want to head. This gives us strategic direction. If we were a boat going across the ocean, our strategy would set our course and give us direction and a heading. And there's 4 phases I'm going to talk about. And these could be labeled various things in different organizations, but they're generally true of how strategic planning is done. And for the Board of Governors exam, we want to use these terms. This is what has been standardized. And there's 4 phases that we're going to look at. That's the assessment phase, the plan development phase, the implementation phase, and then the evaluation of the strategic plan phase. Let's start with that assessment. Every good strategic plan needs to be start with the review of the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Are they still relevant? Have they been utilized and deployed? And is our strategy centered around our mission, vision, and values? Do they align? We also want to use market research. So we look at things like demographics of the population we serve. So race, ethnicity, common disease processes with health statistics. We want to look at customer demand and expectations. What services are going to grow in the future? Which may decline? What do our customers need when they seek out care? Our stakeholder expectations. What are the expectations of our community? What are the expectations of our suppliers? Who are other stakeholders that we need to consider? We need to consider competition. What may the competition be doing? Could there be more competition? How do you compete in your market? Some data we may use is market share. We want to look at technology. So how do we leverage and use technology? And then we want to look at any uncertainties. So what could happen? Certainly the past few years, as we've been dealing with the pandemic, is an uncertainty. But what are the other risks that could be involved as you think about your strategy? What risks should you consider? Some of the tools we want to look at, a SWOT analysis. We want to look at our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is where we get key stakeholders together to talk about those 4 things that may help us influence and decide where we want to take the organization, what we need to focus on. And then we want to consider our financial position. Is it in a place where we can invest? Do we need to strengthen it? How do we continue to make decisions with what are scarce resources ultimately around our financials? In phase 2, we will take that information and those considerations and develop our plan. This is usually done annually, although strategic plans shouldn't be done annually and sit on a shelf. They should be part of the work that we do and reference, and it should be constantly changing. Your strategy may change throughout the year based on things that are going on. It's an iterative process by top management and generally led by the CEO. Decisions about strategic responses and programmatic responses. So in the strategic plan, we want to be decision-oriented. What is our strategy and how are we going to get there? And with those strategic responses, what programs are we going to implement? We want to create specific goals. So if we set a strategy, how are we going to measure and know that we're getting there? So what are our goals? What are our objectives to reach those goals? How are we going to measure it? And under what timeline do we want to achieve those goals? We also want to make sure that we prioritize resource allocation, and that is certainly a financial view, but it's also a resource allocation around your people, around your space. Resources can come in a variety of forms, and we have to consider those as we make decisions on what our next steps for strategic planning are. In phase 2, we also want to have a comprehensive plan that includes all of these things. As we talked about our mission and vision, that certainly sets the pace during phase 1. We want to make sure that's included in phase 2 and that the decisions in the plan align to our mission and vision. We want to think about environment descriptors and forecasts, right? So what's going on in your community, in the environment, both locally and nationally and globally? What forecast do we need to assume? Are there changes in staffing? Maybe there's an increased shortage. We want to look at our service plans. So what services are we going to offer? Are we offering the correct ones? Do we need to shift? Do we need to add? Do we need to take away? We want to look at long-range financial planning. We all do a budget each year, but our strategic planning should really be looking at where do we want to be financially over the long term. We want to look at our facilities plan. Do we have the physical space that we need in order to meet our strategic plan? And if so, how do we ensure that we're using it wisely? And if not, how do we invest to ensure we have the physical plant that we need? And then a human resources plan, highly important, often overlooked. If we want to have a plan for increasing services, different physical plants, using space differently, are we putting a human resources plan together that also allows us strategically to plan? If we know there's a nursing shortage, are we strategically planning of how we're going to deal with the lower supply of nurses? That also includes our medical staff. Have you considered your physicians, your mid-levels? What is that medical model you're going to use? And do we have the staff to take care of the patients? And then our IT, our information services plan. Do we have the technology structure in place? And are we embedding that in what we need to do to ensure that our IT system is ready for the long-term strategy we're developing? All considerations. And if you think about an example, a decision to start or expand a medical service within your hospital requires the commitment of a lot of things: a financial commitment, a staffing commitment to expand that medical service, a medical staff commitment, and an IT support. It's multifaceted. And as you think about that strategy, you've got to work to account for all of those factors. Once we've developed our plan, we want to implement. This is generally done with action plans. And these action plans help us to assign responsibility and accountability to meeting those strategic goals. We want to make sure that there's an alignment of our systems to support that successful implementation. If IT's off doing one thing and human resources is doing another, and those systems aren't aligned, we may not be able to fulfill our strategy. We also want to use departmental operational plans or business plans to develop and achieve the strategic goals and objectives. So as we're adding that service, have we done a business plan to ensure we understand the financials and the steps we need in order to make that successful? And then finally, we want to evaluate our strategic planning. This evaluation is important because it helps determine how we're doing against the plan. Are we meeting the tactics in order to meet those strategic objectives or strategic goals? We want to identify variations in performance. And those may be better than or worse than the performance we expected, and determine the cause of that. Then we want to make adjustments to improve performance. Not only performance to the strategy, but performance to our strategic planning process. And then importantly, we want to learn from failures and successes, because then we can carry those forward to our next strategic planning cycle. And as we talked about everything being interconnected, as we are developing our strategic plan and deploying it, marketing becomes a big piece of that. And marketing is integral to that strategic planning and also that business plan development. And in this section, we're going to talk about marketing. We're going to talk about 4 key areas that we must address. One is our product, one is the place, one is the price, and the other is promotion. And we may have heard these terms in grad school or in marketing class. And so we want to just hit a quick refresher on those. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this, since the objective is to have for you for the Board of Governors exam to have knowledge of both the principles and some of these tools. So let's start with product. This is a strategic assessment. So this is looking at what services may be provided, which comes from an analysis of existing or potential customers, determining customer needs and wants, and purchasing behavior. So essentially, what do our customers seek out from us in healthcare? What products do they want? What services do they want? And are we aligned to our customers? Often we think of an organization that may sell a car, and they make sure that how they build that car, its design, the technology in it, suits the customer that they are trying to attract. Similar in healthcare, we want to attract and serve our community. We have to make sure that we are building our product, our services, to meet the needs of that community. We also want to look at the place. We have to make decisions about where and in what settings our services are provided. This is to ensure they're accessible and will be used by the customer. You may have a great service or product, but if it's in the wrong location, people may not use it. So things to consider, should something be hospital-based? Is it clinic-based? Is it a community outreach? Should it be on the campus of a hospital? Is it a freestanding outpatient? There's a variety of things we have to look at to ensure that our place is correct. We also want to look at price. Services should be priced to be financially viable whenever possible. This means doing break-even analysis on your service offerings. Overall pricing of services and resulting income must exceed the cost of services. That seems obvious. We have to have more money coming in than the service costs in order for it to be viable. That allows us to cross-subsidize some services that we provide to the community as a community service that may not be profitable. And so we have to make sure that overall we're bringing more income in than the cost of providing those services. Pricing potential is also best in those services where patients are willing to use discretionary income to pay. So if you think about where patients can make that choice and use discretionary income, that's a product they're seeking out, more of a retail style business. So as you look at your services that you're providing, you have to determine, is this a retail style service, or is this something they're not going to have a choice in? An ER typically is not a retail style service. They are brought because it's either the closest or brought by ambulance. Some surgeries are more of a retail style, or mammography, some imaging practices. And so we have to think about the pricing in comparison to competition and the demand of the patient and what they're willing to pay from their discretionary income. And then we want to promote. Marketing is all about promoting. And this is defined for the Board of Governors exam as a process of communicating to customers and prospective customers about your organization and its services using a variety of promotional tools that can be grouped into these four things: advertising, sales promotion, personal selling, or publicity. And we're going to talk about some of these. Promotion basically ties to the business plan for that respective service. So how are we going to promote this new service? Let's talk a bit about some of these definitions. In this case, ACHE uses the term advertising as non-personal forms of communication conducted through paid media. These are very traditional styles of advertising: TV commercials, newspaper. These are non-personal, they're mass communication. Sales promotion is defined as a tactical, short-term incentive designed to stimulate target market response. In these, we may focus on a particular subgroup of people. If we want to advertise our women's program, we may focus on females of a certain age range and do a sales promotion about those services. Personal selling is oral presentation with one or more prospective purchases. This is where we go to somebody and talk to them. We may do this in a variety of ways. Perhaps we go to a church and talk about mammography screening with a group of females that are of age for mammography screening. That may be a personal. We bring a physician there to talk to that group about their annual screening. Or perhaps it's to prostate screening at the local Rotary. There's a variety of ways in which we may do personal selling. For publicity, it's planting commercially significant news about the organization or its services in a published media or on radio or television that is not paid for by the sponsor. This may be a good news story that we share with the media, and they come out and they talk to the patient, and in that they are also highlighting your organization. So this is how do we ensure that we're getting positive publicity? There's a lot of different ways, a lot of different media selection, and I'm not going to read all these, but it's important to note that there's a variety, and I would encourage you to take a look at the medium, and then with all of them, their advantages and limitations. And so on here, we've got a list of several of them that you may get asked about on the governor's exam. Make sure you take a look at what some of the advantages of those are and what some of the limitations of those are. But ultimately, all of them have advantages and limitations. And as we think about our strategic plan, our services we offer, and our marketing, we have to be selective in how we use each medium and what we want to accomplish. Because all of those things come with a budget. We don't have likely unlimited dollars to spend around marketing. And so how do we determine how much money to spend on marketing? There's several different ways that we may look at how much we spend on marketing. One's the historical method, where we may just look and say, how much did we spend last year on marketing? And let's just spend the same amount that we did last year. The other may be in what's called the affordable method. This is where we look and say, all right, how much money based on our budget this year can we afford to spend? Or based on the business plan, how much money can we afford to spend? We may also look at it as a percent of sales. So if our sales are going to be $100 and we want to spend 10% on marketing, we would set a budget of $10. We may do competitive-based method. So we look at our competitors and we see they are doing a certain number of TV spots and radio and billboard, and we may want to match that or exceed it, and our spend would be based on what our competitor's doing. We may have an objective and task method. So we may pick something specific and say we want to be on social media, we want to be at the top of everyone's search for a particular service. We may spend based on keeping at the top of that particular search. Our objective is to be the first thing they see, and the task is to pay Google to put us at the top of that search. We also may look at a sales response optimization method. Sales response optimization method is where we look at what the expected response is to what we're selling, and we have very targeted marketing for that particular service. So again, if we're going to market, let's say, our women's program, we may be very targeted at optimizing the best way to reach our female audience. And that may mean we're not going to do billboards, but we're going to do targeted social media. Or perhaps it means that we're going to advertise in a magazine because there's an optimized way of doing that. Or perhaps it is in a flyer mailed to the house. Whatever it is, it's how do we optimize the best spend of our dollars to reach the target audience? And what is the strategy to do that? As we think about marketing, we have to consider our product life cycle, and the amount we spend for a service may change based on where the product is in its life cycle. In the introduction, spending more on marketing may be very important because advertising and promotion are very important in the introduction phase to get the word out, to help the public understand what you're trying to sell. If we're trying to grow it, we may rely more on word of mouth supplement to that marketing. Once somebody has used the women's program that I've used as an example, they may spread that by word of mouth if they've had a good experience. We want to continue to promote and build market share through this introduction and then through our growth and that word of mouth. As our service matures, we may want to intensify promotion to meet competition and advertise when we have new product uses and features. Say we've added robotic surgery. Our women's program may be at maturity, but we are adding in a new component to it. And so we want to make sure we're advertising that new component. Or if we have a competitor that is taking market share or perhaps entering our market, we may want to intensify our promotion of our mature product in order to stave off some of that competition. And then we have to decide if our product's on a decline. And if it is, and it's not being used anymore, we may want to reduce promotion costs to improve the margin so that we can ensure that we are reducing expenses for a product that may be in decline. We also have to think about our consumer adoption process. This is a term by which potential customers come to learn about a new product or service, try it, and eventually adopt it or reject it. So this is essentially our consumer life cycle. And there's some stages to that. First, the consumer becomes aware of the new product or service. Then they show interest. So is this something they want to use? Once they use it, once they determine if they want to use it, they evaluate. So they may say or look at, do I want to use this program or competitor's program? Once they've evaluated what the right program is or what the right service is or what the right company is to use, they'll trial the product. So the first time they use it, they would trial it. And then what we want to move them to ultimately is adoption. And that's where we get our returning customers because they've adopted use. And if we think about how many customers we have in each life cycle, it's generally broken up into these adopter classifications. Our innovators, the first 2.5% of the customers that go through that life cycle are going to be considered your innovators. And that's going to start small and they're going to move through quickly. Then you're going to get about 13.5% of your customers as early adopters. And then once you have your innovators and early adopters, they will start spreading word of mouth. And then you get your early majority, which is that first group that's interested. They've heard some good things. They're coming in. Then once you have a mass of people that have used a service, you've got your late majority, which is that second 34%. And then your laggers who finally either reluctantly use it or may have to use it for the first time, where they finally hear enough about it that they want to give it a try. Important to note that adoption classification, you may get asked that, but that's in general the spread of adopters for our consumers. Let's talk a little bit about business plans. This is a term that may come up in your exam. Business plans are detailed operational plans that are developed to achieve the strategic goals and objectives. So you heard me talk about that a bit in the strategic planning process. There's some important notes on the business plan. It needs to address the what, who, when, where, and how questions. We want to expect service delivery and financial targets. Again, we want to be able to measure. And generally, we look at what is the best, worst, and most likely cases. Our methods for measuring outcomes of the project are designed in the plan. So we look at volumes, quality, cost, revenues, margin. We want to select, how do we ensure that the plan and the business plan, how do we ensure we're successful? And that's what those outcomes are. And so we want to have a blended approach. Usually there's not just one single outcome. Volumes are great, but if we're not meeting the margin, are we successful? Volumes are great, but if the quality is not there, are we successful? And so we have to outline that in our business plan. Some other key components of a business plan generally include a description of the project, a situation assessment, so what's going on, our target markets, so who are we going after with this particular service, who are our key target areas, our objectives, so what do we want to achieve with this business plan and this new service, what are the specific steps needed to accomplish the project, so what are our to-dos, so to speak, what's our timeline for getting it done, and then our financial analysis or pro forma should be in there. This tells us if the project is financially viable. There should also be an evaluation component. This we want to use to show how the outcome of the project will be measured. So again, what are those objective ways we're going to measure how well the project worked? All of those are part of our business plan. And as we roll out these business plans, certainly public and community relations are important because ultimately public perception is reality. Remember that key term, public perception is reality. Whatever your best laid plans are, whatever the public perceives is what they are going to believe, and that is their reality. Good public relations successfully communicate a positive public perception. That seems pretty obvious, but if our public relations is good, we want to make sure that we are having a positive image in our community. A lot of that comes down to credibility, especially in healthcare. Creating some key public and community relations is important to drive that credibility. And public and community relations should be proactive, not reactive. So we don't want to wait for the public to form an opinion. We want to make sure they understand what's going on. We educate, we partner with the community, and we promote with the community. And public relations is absolutely a process. And we need to remember that it's not a one and done, it's a constant process. So let's talk about what that process is. We want to imagine for a minute what the organization is perceived to be versus reputation, which is based on what the organization actually does. So we want to identify the organization's relevant publics. So who in the community is relevant for what the perception may be. We want to measure images and attitudes of those relevant publics toward the organization. So if we want to serve our women's program of women of childbearing age, for instance, how do we know what the image and attitudes of that population is? Or if we want to ensure that we have the best end-of-life services, how do we ensure that we're measuring the images and attitudes of that part of the population? We want to establish image and attitude goals for these key publics. So what do we want the perception of our program to be? And then we want to develop cost-effective public relations strategies. This has to be a balance. Again, we have limited resources. How do we ensure there's cost effectiveness around the public relations strategies? And then we want to implement these actions and evaluate the results. So we want to focus on personal interaction. We want to improve the day-to-day interactions between patients and caregivers. That's an internal process, right? So inside the organization, we can work with our caregivers. Again, going back to the women's program, are we treating our mothers giving birth in the way in which they'd want to be treated, and our caregivers' interactions what we'd expect them to be? And to do that, we want to enhance employee morale. We want to pay attention to the job satisfaction issues so that employees feel good about what they do. Highly important that we engage with our employees who will also help with our public image and interaction with our patients. And then externally, we want to do a couple of things. We want to connect with the community. So how are we involved in the community? How does our program connect back to the community, ensure we're meeting the community's needs? And then how do we work with the media? proactively reaching out and partnering with the media on stories versus being reactive. So our functions have to be both internal to the work we do and external to the community we serve. All right, I want to jump now to a little bit on policies and procedure. And these are important because they help set the culture of an organization, and every organization has a culture, and that's either by design or default. Policies and procedures can help us create a designed culture because they're an expression of that desired culture of the organization, and procedures are then put in place to guide behaviors so that the behaviors are consistent with that culture. Policies and procedures should support the mission, vision, and values of the organization, not be counter to them. Policies should communicate to employees, customers, and other stakeholders what they can expect. And standard procedures should ensure consistent performance and quality while reducing opportunity for error. So policies are intended to help an organization reach their objective, and there's a couple of different types here. There's general policies. This term is a policy that applies to the entire organization. Operational policies may pertain to a specific unit, department, or service. So we may have a policy within a specific department. That would be an operational policy. And then our general policy would apply something like a dress code potentially to the entire organization. Our procedures, these are documented specific actions for organization members. They're defined in a standard sequence of steps to complete a task. So we may have a procedure of how we handle a fire in the building. We may have a procedure for how we handle HR issues. Those are steps that ensure culturally we meet the policies that are set. Let's talk about what makes good policies and procedures. One, they're consistent with the larger organizational objectives. They can't go against the larger organizational objectives. Impact is well thought out before they're formalized. So policies and procedures can have a large impact in an organization. We want to ensure we've thought about the impact they may have. They have to be somewhat flexible because a lot of times we have unique situations, especially in healthcare. And if the policy and procedure is so rigid that we can't adapt to those unique situations, then it may not be a good policy and procedure, it may be too rigid. Policies and procedures need to be ethical and legal. That is an absolute standard and have to reflect the values of the organization. They also have to be clear and be able to be understood. If they are not clear, they aren't good. And they have to be consistent with each other. We can't have two competing policies or competing procedures across the organization. All right, from policies and procedures, next topic we're going to cover is a little bit around business contracts. So let's talk about the definition of a contract. It's a written or spoken agreement, especially one concerning employment, sales, or tenancy that is intended to be enforceable by law. So a couple other definitions: an agreement creating obligation enforceable by law, or a contract is a legally binding or valid agreement between two parties. Let's talk about a few different types. Let's start with governing contract law. These contracts are usually governed and enforced by the laws of the state where the agreement is made. So the state has governing authority, and contracts may have different applicable laws based on the state that you're in. A contract may be governed by one of the two types of state law. There's common law and the Uniform Commercial Code. Common law usually applies to contracts such as employment agreements, leases, general business agreements, and the Uniform Commercial Code helps protect the sale of goods. Contracts will usually have a clause in it that this agreement shall be governed by the laws of the state of which the contract is being enforced in. And so that will dictate what those state governing laws are based on where the contract is being executed. So difference in common and Uniform Commercial Code, need to remember that. And remember that the state that the contract is initiated in is the one that has the governing authority, and each state may have slightly different laws for those common law and Uniform Commercial Code. There are certain elements that are there to make something a contract. You have to have competent parties. There must be something called consideration. There must be an offer and an acceptance. There has to be a duty to perform, legal purpose, So the contract must have a legal purpose, and it has to be mutually agreed upon or assented to. So it can't be done under coercion or distress. If we have a breach to a contract, the breach of duty is a breach of a contract occurs when one of the parties fails to perform one or more of the responsibilities agreed to in the contract. This is considered breach of duty. So how do we remedy that? Generally, there's 4 ways. One, there's damages, expectation damages, consequential damages, and punitive damages. These are either financial or emotional or reputational damages done by breach of duty. So if someone breaches a contract and there are consequences, let's say someone breaches a contract and it causes me, I bought a lot of raw material to build something for someone by contract, and they agreed to purchase it by contract. If they refuse to purchase, my damages may be the consequences of having spent that money and not having the product purchased. And so I can collect damages for that. Punitive may be if a contract breach exists that causes an issue and there is a punitive action. So a judge may award punitive damages. Those are damages that are meant to punish the contract breacher. Reliance interest is expenses spent in reliance on the contract going through as promised. So if you spend money and there's a breach of duty, then some of the remedies may be that I get paid back the expenses that I spent relying on that contract, such as legal fees or such as labor that I hired in order to fulfill my part of the contract. Specific performance is a court order to do what was promised. So the court may order the person breaching the contract or company breaching the contract to perform what they agreed to in the contract. Or there could be a verdict of rescission, where the whole contract is set aside and the parties are returned to the position they were before they entered into the agreement. So the contract essentially becomes void and both parties return to the state prior to the contract. So these are all different legal remedies when there is a breach of duty or breach of contract. And how do we get to these resolutions when we have contract disputes? They can come in a couple of different ways. It could come through negotiation. So the 2 parties may negotiate a change to the contract and amend the contract based on that agreement. It could also go to alternative dispute resolution. So if the 2 parties can't come to an agreement, they may seek out mediation or arbitration, where a third party helps to resolve that dispute, looks at both sides and makes a determining factor. And the 2 parties are contractually bound and legally bound to abide by that mediation or arbitration decision. And then the other is litigation, which is a lawsuit where one party may sue another to resolve the breach. Quick overview of contracts. Again, not meant to be legal, but please take a look at the terms throughout and ensure you have an overarching understanding. That is the end of the presentation for the business section. Again, this is a lot about the terms used and definitions within ACHE and the Board of Governors exam. I look forward to any questions you may have. And you can reach me at john.kueven, Kueven, @wellstar.org. Thank you for joining.